Hi. Before we get into this conversation, I want to let you know about something I've been working on for a while and which is now available for free on my website. It's a piece called Myth for Modern Men, A Letter to My Son. Again, you can download this for free on my website, explorerpoet.com. I wrote this letter to provide a guide which my son can reference during his own individuation quest, kind of like a map for growing up, maturing, and finding his way in this chaotic world. Today, perhaps more than ever, the world needs men who are balanced, aware, emotionally intelligent, and driven to become whole individuals who can contribute to families, communities, and society in a healthy way. Rather than encourage the process of self-discovery, modern institutions often force men into compliance or predetermined roles. Society seldom encourages young men to explore their values nor think critically, and they don't teach necessary truths about the self, myth, psychology, emotions, fulfillment, education, money, careers, spirituality, relationships, or sex. In Myth for Modern Men, I tackled these topics and many more in a manner that I hope is clear and digestible. Again, you can download Myth for Modern Men for free by visiting my website, explorerpoet.com. Okay, thanks, and please enjoy this conversation. Okay, hi, Paul. Welcome to the Explorer Poet podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I was really interested in speaking with you because it seems like, first of all, it seems like you have a lot of shared interest with me, but it also, you've gone into some very specific things in your writing, in your books, and I thought it would be really cool to catch up with you on that. And one of the things I just noticed actually on that you had posted to Twitter this morning is it correct that today is the 1-year anniversary of your paperback being published?
Yeah. Pan came out in paperback 1 year ago today in the UK from Reaction Books. They're based over there. And then a month later, it came out in paperback over here where they're distributed by University of Chicago Press. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I want to get into Pan because it's actually a character that I find fascinating. And the kind of the most modern known version of it, Peter Pan, is one of the stories that I find infinitely fascinating, interesting. I think it's really worth diving into for our time period.
Sure.
But before we get to that, I'm just curious from, what is your story when it comes to myth and stories? Like, what is this connection to you, and why does it draw you in? What's interesting about it to you?
Yeah. Well, I think like a lot of people, I grew up reading the Greek myths and the Norse myths, and at some point I discovered the Celtic myths as well, and I've always been interested in myth. I think I think that myth, taps into a lot of universal concerns, um, and I think through storytelling we often find ways of working through some of the kind of basic life situations we find ourselves in, but we also can think about our relationships to the natural world, to the cosmos. And I think myths try to find answers through stories to some of those questions that we can't necessarily answer. And unless we're kind of within the culture, which we're not, if we're talking about ancient Greek myths or Norse myths or whatever, we're not necessarily looking at these stories as true in the sense they're requiring us to believe in them in some way. But I think they offer, again, interesting perspectives on the way we've thought about um, the big questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? How should we behave to each other? What is our relationship to the unknown, the divine? Those kinds of questions. And I mean, I think at root, if we're still interested in myths, it's because they're interesting stories. I mean, whatever they mean to us, we can just kind of enjoy them as stories. But I do think they raise these kind of bigger questions about things. And kind of in my earlier kind of academic work, looking at a writer and painter I find really interesting named David Jones. I was kind of drawn to him because he turns to a lot of traditional Celtic myths like we find in the Mabinogion in his work, and sort of connects them to the present in all kinds of interesting ways. So I've always been interested in myth, and I think in the case of Pan, um, we have, and I guess we'll talk a little bit more about him, but there are very few myths around him, and so he's a really intriguing figure to think about in relation to myth, in part because there's so few actual myths about him, and yet, he's a kind of persistent presence in the ancient world, and one that continues to fascinate people today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting the way you talk about being in the culture versus looking back at past cultures, because it really is easy to look at the Greeks, the Norse, the Celts, and see what their stories were and what they were trying to teach them in the time. They become interesting to us. But it's almost as if when we're in the myth, we don't even realize it's a myth. We almost just perceive it as reality, and we let that kind of guide our thinking, guide our behavior. So what was there a moment in your youth or at some point when you first realized that kind of what these myths were, like where you got to this point where you said, oh, these are teaching us things. These are, there's some depth here where somebody was searching for something. Was there like a key moment for you where this kind of clicked and then myths they kind of opened up to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I think probably, in my 20s, I sort of discovered the work of Carl Jung, and his whole idea of of archetypes, and the idea that myths are um, myths are dramatizing aspects of our own psyches, our own inner journeys, um, and again, I think like a lot of people, at some point in there, I read Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, uh, and in some ways, those Jung and Joseph Campbell belong to an earlier time, and their ideas have come in for a lot of criticism and kind of academic circles and things. But I think that they both kind of tapped into this feeling we have that we read these stories and we connect with them. They resonate in some way. And I think there's a kind of experience that is difficult to explain away. It's difficult to maybe even frame in kind of purely academic kinds of terms. And I think Campbell and Jung both sort of recognized that. I mean, whatever you think about the reality of archetypes, or the notion that we might have a collective unconscious that these stories are in some way emerging out of, they do resonate with readers, and readers who don't necessarily belong to the culture they're coming from, like you mentioned, and I think that experience is a really interesting one. So yeah, so I would say that was probably my you know my my introduction to the idea that these are just more, or can be more than stories. You know, they have this quality. I really like Jung's idea of the numinous, like this idea there's something kind of inexplicable, energizing, mysterious, and I think that quality is something we find in great works of art, but also in religious stories and myths as well. And again, we don't necessarily have to believe in the religion or believe that the myth is literally true, but that sense. I kind of come back to this word of resonance. That it resonates with us. It connects with us in some way that's hard to articulate, because it's a feeling. I think at root. I don't know if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
it makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, I've read a lot of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell as well, and the thing that strikes me about them, or similar seekers, is that this thing that you're talking about with the academic world, or the world of empirical testing that's looking for truth and information through process and validation and this kind of thing. At some root core, there seems to be a similar desire when it comes, like a similar need to find truth when it comes to the people who are exploring myth, who are exploring the psyche. It just seems like perhaps there are these two options. There's like the scientific route, and then there's this other route, which is, it comes through, like you're saying, comes through feeling and comes through experience. And you can't always correlate everybody's experiences, but it's it really is that resonance or that numinosity, that numinous feeling that's sitting with people, and that holds them. I also think that it's interesting the way that we look at past myths, and they still connect with us. And in a way, I almost think of it as these are the myths that led up to our current myth. And so in a way, it's kind of like reading about you could call them like obviously they're our ancestral myths, but it's almost like they're the grandparents of the myth that we're embodying today. And so in a way, it's there's always going to be that resonance as long as you spend the time with the story.
Yeah, I think these myths of other earlier cultures, we're really thinking about Western cultures here, but they're kind of like studying them as kind of like a kind of archaeology of the myths and stories that shape us. And I think I think you made a good point earlier, sort of thinking about this idea of myths as stories that we don't necessarily have to believe, but that going along with a kind of lack of awareness of the myths that shape the way we currently think. And even if you look at, something like religious fundamentalism, right? And in whatever form, I mean, people who subscribe to kind of fundamentalist versions of religion, they are in a sense doing what Joseph Campbell said everybody does, which is living the myth. But they're living the myth in a way that is completely unaware of it as a myth. It's maybe a set of stories, a set of teachings or instructions, or beliefs that are presented as literally true and must be obeyed in some way for fear of punishment. And even though the punishment is usually presented as ultimately divine in origin, in reality, the punishment is often a social one, even in a society, like the United States, where people who belong to really narrow kind of fundamentalist versions of religion often faced ostracism, sometimes even abuse from the people in their communities. And these are in some ways they show the dangers of myth too. Like if we just completely embrace this mythic worldview without thinking about it, without thinking about its possibilities, but also its limitations, or kind of the ethics involved in believing a certain set of teachings or something, I think that's when we kind of run into trouble. In some ways, it's allowing myth to do too much for us, shaping our behavior and so on in ways that don't require us to do any of the work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, again, that makes a lot of sense to me. I grew up in a situation that was very religious and you could call it fundamental. It was the word that I use now is literal. They thought of the myth as very literal, and like you were saying, when it's just teachings from on high and you accept that, when it's commandments or doctrines that you have to live and rituals that you have to complete, it becomes very literal. And going back to Carl Jung, I think what happens when you have these literal interpretations of a scripture or a myth, what ends up happening is that you become completely unaware of what you're not aware of, right? Your shadow.
Yeah.
And so the culture that I experienced being within it, there's just a huge shadow of people not getting to be their true selves, people being punished for, just like you were saying, the punishment comes as not something that happens after this life, but it's in the social contract, where if you don't live up to the rules of the group, the literal interpretation of the group, then because you've kind of like moved into their shadow, they just don't even know how to tolerate you, because if they were to tolerate you, it's almost as if you would point out the things that they're doing. So I think that from my perspective now, when I think about myth, because I grew up so long thinking that myth was literal, now I see it as every myth is this tool that could be used for a psychological analysis. And you could take every myth and obviously apply it inward and apply it to yourself, which I think is probably the best way to do it. but you can also then apply it to the group as if the individual is just a smaller manifestation of the larger group, and the groups that aren't aware, or the individuals that aren't aware that their myth isn't literal, they're the ones who end up, I think, doing the most damage.
Yeah. And I think I liked your point about, when because I grew up in a kind of conventionally but pretty liberal Catholic, you know, home and community, and there was a fair amount of tolerance for different opinions and things like that, but it was still in the context of a very kind of rigid institutional sort of faith. And I think that the problem when we don't realize the myths we're living in are not uh, necessarily literally true, or we just kind of accept them in that literal way, is that we don't we don't think about we really don't think about what they mean, right? And I think like what you're describing, thinking about, what does the story mean for us as an individual? Like, what does it mean for my inner life? But what does it mean for my relationship to the people in my community who kind of share this myth? It can very easily just become going through the motions, but going through the motions in a way that, as you suggest, can be very exclusive, and at its worst can just become outright abusive of people, um, and deny that all of those areas that the myth doesn't kind of include, or maybe approve of. Uh, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that yeah, I've experienced that in my own life. But yeah, you see it in anytime you come up against a group who's really ingrained in their belief system. I think one thing that's interesting now is that obviously there are still plenty of religions out there, but I think that there are a lot of myths that have captured groups of people that aren't necessarily related to some deity in the sky or some deity that looks over us. And I'm curious, when you observe the world, or when you think about these things, are there myths that you've identified that are the modern myths that people fall into? And do they what kind of, when we look at those myths literally, what kind of outcomes do you see?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think I it seems to me that even though this has been true probably for at least the last 100 years, maybe longer, I think one myth that Western societies still seem to be very much enthralled to is the myth of progress. And again, using myth here in a way that is not saying there's no progress. I mean, clearly, we can combat diseases that we couldn't combat, whatever, 100 or 200 years ago. But the idea that sort of every day in every way, the world is just getting better, and that technology and endless economic growth are going to solve all of our problems eventually. We're just kind of moving towards there, and I think it's made us very, very, very vulnerable to the unintended consequences of technology. For example, thinking about just one kind of obvious example, the effects of social media on mental health, particularly children, adolescents, things like that. So we embrace these myths, and I think you know technology has almost become a myth in itself. Like, we're absolutely enthralled by it, and it's the solution for everything. And I think that I don't know. To me, that seems to be the dominant myth. That doesn't really involve any deities or necessarily supernatural kinds of beliefs, but just this belief that uh, technology is continually improving and is continually improving our lives without really considering the consequences of that. I mean, it's it's those shadow qualities, right? You mentioned. So we we lose ourselves in the little screens, and we ignore our bodies, our emotional well-being, our social relationships, and things like that, because we're so focused on the screen in front of us. And you know I'm as much part of this world as anybody else. It's hard to navigate, but always in the background there's the sense that this is kind of how things should be, and it's going to get even better. um, you know
Yeah, I think about progress and efficiency and I think about that as well. And it's interesting to me that in the East, if we're going to talk about the Eastern philosophy, in the East, they gave this up a long time ago. They kind of said, okay, we'll accept things as they are. And in the West, it's almost as if we went the complete opposite direction, and we said we'll make things so good that we never have to worry again. And we clearly haven't gotten there yet with all this advanced technology and nuclear power and artificial intelligence right around the corner, and we still haven't gotten there. And sometimes I honestly think that when it, if there's some catastrophe in the Western world, probably the group that's going to survive is the Amish, because they still have this model where they're reliant on nobody outside of their immediate community, where they have whatever information or technology they need to survive, they have it all right there. It's interesting that is the current myth, and I wonder, I hope that it works out for everybody.
I hope so too, but you're right. I mean, we're, I would say on average, it's hard to talk about people in general, but I think probably on average, we're as individuals able to do sort of less in terms of survival and, that old American ideal of self-reliance than earlier generations were, right? Because we're increasingly reliant on technology to sort of do it for us, and sort of the systems it supports and things like that. But yeah, a community like the Amish, that's was around before any of these modern developments happened, they could probably survive the collapse of at least some of this modern world. Whereas, if you think what would happen to us if the power grid went down, I mean, survive a few days, but then it it'd be catastrophic for us. And so we've made ourselves very reliant on systems that most of us don't really understand, can't do anything about, couldn't repair or rebuild. And that's it's a little concerning, because we need to maintain, we really need to maintain the status quo to a large extent if we're going to continue, and whether or not that's viable, I think is unclear.
Yeah, well, I think it's at least good to think about it. It's at least good to talk about it, because in some way maybe we're just pulling some attention to what the modern shadow is in the culture, and it's probably beneficial just to begin having those conversations. I want to, before we go too far into this, because I don't want to eat up all the time with this, but I wanted to just give you a chance to talk about your new Substack that you've started. It's called Thresholds, and you're writing on myth, folklore, and literature. It's pretty new. I think when I looked, you had a couple of posts up. And I'm just curious, what's the impetus and what do you hope to do with this?
Well, yeah, the impetus is partly in kind of reading for, things that I'm interested in, things that are related to, my current writing project. I don't really have an outlet for a lot of, sort of my thoughts about them. And sometimes, I might come across a book or some figure, some person or something that I think would be kind of fun to explore. So it is just getting started, but I'm kind of thinking of it right now as kind of an outlet for writing about topics, books that don't necessarily fit into what I'm currently working on, but I think might be of interest to to readers who enjoyed Pan, who have some of these same interests that I do as well. Because I think I think I need to have an outlet for things. So it's helpful for me if I read a book I think is really interesting. It helps me to kind of organize my thoughts a little bit about it and reflect on it. But I'm hoping to write a little more directly about myth as well. So we'll see what happens. It is pretty new, but that's what I'm kind of thinking about that.
Okay. So as you go through, you probably read a lot of books and research, but also just because it's interesting to you. And you just, I feel this way sometimes where I just read so much and it informs me in ways, and I just want to be able to share that with other people, or just,
Right.
with people who are interested. But it is a good question, like what is the best format and how do you do it efficiently and or effectively? And the other challenge is if you're focused on a specific book, not everything you come across is going to need to be in that book. In fact, you can't put everything in that book, but there's probably things here or there that you just want to speak directly to, and maybe in less of a long form manner, but just share some quick thoughts on it. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So,
Okay. Any idea of schedules, or is this going to be kind of like a as get it as it comes project?
well, right now I'm because I am busy. I am busy with this current book I'm putting together, but my plan is every other week. So I'm going to get the next post. I think it'll be up on Tuesday. So I'm thinking of a couple of ideas for that, but I'll get something together, and hopefully be something kind of fun and interesting for the next one. I don't want it to be all book reviews,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
yeah, something else.
Yeah. I guess one of the nice things about doing a Substack, they're kind of like the modern blog where it doesn't have to be, everything doesn't have to be in sequence or in chapters, and it doesn't have to all be related. It can just be whatever comes up. You can have a kind of a go at it.
I kind of like the idea of the sort of random thoughts about something
Yeah.
approach,
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Well, that's cool. I think it'll be, I mean, I'm interested to see what comes of it. Just like reading all the authors of the past, people who've gone through and have dug through a lot of stories and myth, the Joseph Campbells, and that, I don't know, it's fascinating to me to see it all, just people who go explore it and then pull it out, and what's available for us today. So
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, so let's get into your book, Pan. It's called
Yeah.
Pan, the Great God's Modern Return. And again, as I mentioned before, probably the most well-known modern version of Pan is the Peter Pan story, with Captain Hook and Wendy and the boys. And to me, we don't have to focus on that, but to me, that there's like a very real connection to our modern day through that story. And Pan's only a piece of it, but who's the original Pan, and where did he come from, and why is he important? And again, what drew you to this character or this archetype?
Sure. Yeah. So Pan was the ancient Greek god of the wild, and the god of shepherds as well. He seems to have started out as the god of shepherds, and then um, uh, kind of expanded over time. So he was the god of places that humans wouldn't go, like crags and mountains and forests and things like that. So he started out in Arcadia, which was a very mountainous, wooded place. It was difficult to farm there. The Arcadians did farm and live in towns, but the other Greeks thought of them as this kind of wild men, and they had to supplement their limited agriculture with hunting. Pan was also god of the hunt. That's kind of a feature that got lost a bit along the way, but they had to supplement that with raising flocks, hunting, and things like that. So he started out there, and he was eventually adopted. His cult sort of spread throughout the rest of Greece. He was adopted at Athens after helping them win a battle against the Persians at Marathon. And the Athenians, Herodotus reports a story that the Athenians told that when they had sent a runner named Philippides or Philippides to rally the Spartans, the runner encountered Pan along the way, and Pan said to him, "Hey, uh, I look after the Athenians. I like the Athenians. How come I'm not honored there? Because if I'm honored there, I will, come to their aid." And so when he got back, he reported this, and the Athenians honored Pan, and they won the Battle of Marathon. And so they instituted some games for him, and so on. But Pan's cult spread throughout the ancient world. the Romans identified him with a similar god named Faunus, and in later times, um, Pan really he became a kind of a cosmic god because his name sounds like the ancient Greek word for all, pan, which we still have, like in pandemic or Pan American Games or something like that. And so he kind of became seen as this cosmic kind of power with um, a relationship to Zeus, and he he in some ways he changes based on what society's sort of needs are, or you could also view it kind of the other way around, which is that we have a god who is discovered and experienced in different ways by people throughout time. And so in modern times, one of his more popular kind of manifestations is as the horned god of the witches. He's often identified with that in modern witchcraft, for example. So he's a god who appears in all kinds of places and in all kinds of interesting ways. Um, but I think one way to kind of think about his origins is to come back to a point you raised earlier on, this idea of the shadow side of our culture. And for the ancient Greeks, they're civilized, they're very urbane. Apollo is the god of reason and the arts, and he's honored everywhere. And Pan is this shaggy, half human, half goat figure who really embodies those qualities the Greeks essentially rejected or looked down upon, or scorned in some way. So the wilderness, the countryside, the animal world, all of those kinds of things that were um, things that the ancient Greeks kind of wanted to put to one side, or didn't value as highly as reason and order, that kind of thing. And so Pan was often a figure of fun for the ancient Greeks, and uh, because he was identified as a kind of country bumpkin god, he was viewed affectionately, but not necessarily taken seriously. I think that's one reason why we don't have a lot of myths, and the ones that we do have, I think, are a bit they're a bit questionable. Like Ovid told the story of Pan chasing a nymph named Syrinx, who, to escape him, turned herself into a reed, and that's the origin of his pipes. But that's a really late myth. Like that's from the reign of Augustus in Rome. Um, there is one feature about Pan's role in the ancient world that makes him really different from the other gods, and that's actually his death. He's the only god in ancient times who was thought to have died. And the ancient writer Plutarch records that it's one of these secondhand stories. He heard from someone who heard from someone who was on a boat with someone who had heard this great cry as they were traveling by ship, that Pan was dead, and to let everyone know. And the Emperor Tiberius apparently took this seriously, and he asked his counselors, who did some investigations, and they claimed that Pan was indeed dead. And yet, when the Greek writer Pausanias visited Greece a century later, he was still being worshipped in Arcadia. And so he clearly did not die, at least for his followers and so on. But this idea that Pan had died kind of took off, and that was adopted later on by Christians who looked at it in different ways. Some looked at it as symbolizing the death of paganism, that, and so sort of got reimagined as happening at the time of Christ's death or his birth. Other Christian writers in later centuries thought that maybe Pan was actually Christ, and that this was sort of how the pagan world was told of Christ's death in some way. So it's a really interesting myth in its own way. But Pan was the only one of those ancient Greek gods who was thought to have died. So that really makes him stand out in some interesting ways as well.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I'd never actually heard that. So are there any related resurrection stories or coming back to life stories that would also connect him to the early Christian ideas?
No, and that's what's so strange about it, because there are other gods in the ancient world who die and resurrect, like Osiris, for example, in the Egyptian pantheon. But Pan just dies in this version of the story, and uh, so he's unique in that regard, because of course the gods are immortal. So how can an immortal god die? It
Yeah.
raises questions about, what exactly was Pan. He wasn't one of the 12 Olympians. He never quite he was never quite seen as that level of god. He was a more local, more accessible, more human friendly god, than the Olympians were. Um, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. Also, the connection to the way you talk about him as being representative of the horned god of the witches, and of being more of the countryside, of the country bumpkin. Pan is half, kind of like half human form and half animal form, correct? And so
Right.
it's
Yeah.
to compare that to whatever the Greeks were becoming in Athens and Sparta and their big city states. It's interesting that they would begin to spurn that thing that is still so primitive, or not as civilized. But then also, anytime there's fun, there's celebration, there's, some lasciviousness, then all of a sudden Pan is welcome and he's part of it. And it kind of speaks to this reality of pleasure being central to the body in a way. I find that
Yeah.
interesting.
It is, and Pan was often depicted in the retinue of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, and so absolutely he was connected with pleasure and celebration and so on. And um, from from the evidence we have, it seems Pan was worshipped with the night of drinking. People would go to a cave. The gods like to be worshipped, or approached rather, in silence, except for Pan. If you were approaching Pan, worshippers would clap their hands, bang on pots, and things like that, and he'd be honored with a night of feasting and drinking and carrying on. And so it's kind of interesting, thinking about Pan as kind of embodying these shadow sorts of qualities, because the ancient Greeks didn't exclude him completely. Like they did find a way to sort of integrate him into their world, even though it was one that um, you know valued civilization as they understood it, over those more rural and those more rural kinds of pursuits, and what we call the natural world, things like that.
Yeah, the natural world is what came to mind, especially when you think about moving from the Greek and Roman worlds into the more Christian world, where civilization takes another step away from, you could call it the natural world, or, the natural man, or the body, or whatever it is. It's interesting that Pan gets then associated with witches, who are obviously deep within the Christian shadow, because they don't want to acknowledge that there are these things out there that may be, with the Christian, in the Christian theology, you have this one God who provides everything you need. And so anything that's being provided from something else is inherently bad or inherently dangerous. And that goes right along with this type of fun, I guess, that Pan likes to have, where in the Christian world, there really is, at least in the world that I grew up in, and, sitting in a Catholic mass, or even probably going to a Jewish synagogue, there's not a lot of noise and celebration and revelry. It's a lot of quietness, and it's very solemn, and God wants reverence, and the Holy Spirit approaches you when you're reverent and in a state of quiet, submissive contemplation. And it seems like Pan would be pretty antithetical to that situation.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think that's true, and so in a way, Pan continues to embody these kinds of, as we're calling them, these sort of shadow qualities, right? I mean, he's he's noisy, he's ecstatic, he's sexual, sometimes in a way that is dangerous and threatening, um, and it's all of those things that are not present when we're silent and reverential and so on. And so he's a difficult god to come to terms with, perhaps in the modern world, even if we're not personally committed to, one of those traditional faiths. Our culture has been so shaped by them and their attitudes, feelings about the body, attitudes towards certain kinds of behavior, and things like that. There's still, we generally take a dim view of drunken rowdiness, right? Except maybe at the end of a football game or something like that, where it might be considered appropriate. But it's not, those kinds of behaviors are not really integrated very well into our world, I think.
Yeah, and especially when you think about the things that are considered sacred. It's hard, I think, for the modern Western world to consider a lot of that stuff as sacred in a way. But if you want to have, I guess, more of a balanced experience, a balanced reality in life, then perhaps there is an aspect of misbehaving, an aspect of having that wild drunken night on occasion that is a little bit of a part of that balance that the world needs. And if from a Carl Jung perspective, again, healing is, or growing, individuating is kind of finding that balance between what you used to think was good and righteous and appropriate, and being willing to step into the realm of things that maybe aren't socially acceptable, but are still something that inside of you still have that ancient man that, with given the story of evolution, where did we come from? And maybe some of that is still in us. And maybe every now and then, just from a emotional health and mental health perspective, we need to balance that out a little bit.
Yeah. And Pan, with his half human, half animal form, it is sort of visually a kind of reminder that, a reminder of our instinctive life, that we share our life with the lives of animals. And if we completely repress and exclude that part of ourselves, we're not going to be healthy. We're not going to be well. And the fact that Pan was regarded as a divinity is also suggesting that this is also a part of ourselves where we can find the sacred. It's not only in those moments. I mean, the Greeks practiced prayer and reverence, and a lot of all these these ancient and Near Eastern faiths. They had some things in common in terms of how you approached the divinity. But Pan reminds us that the sacred is also found elsewhere. It might even be found in places that we don't think of at all as being sacred. And so, so he remains a kind of challenge for us, almost a rebuke, of looking at our relationship to the non-human world, including the divine, as in such a narrow way, and so humorlessly. I mean, that's the other thing. Pan is funny. His appearance is funny, and so he kind of undermines that seriousness too, that often goes along with our normal understanding of piety and reverence and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Christian world, the Western world, got to a point where they had completely separated, whatever spirit, we use this word spirituality, but they have this idea of a spirit or a soul inside of everybody that is separate from the body. And
right.
Coming later on, you get people like Nietzsche who says, well, your body is actually that is your spirit. And, you have the alchemists who are saying that you go and you find spirituality through things that are disgusting and gross. You have feces, you have dung, whatever it may be. That's the beginning of discovering that spirituality. So I think it's pretty interesting, those separations. Moving beyond, say, like the Greeks and the Romans, what other characters are out there that are then associated with Pan from other pantheons or other, collections of mythology, whether it's Norse or some of the pagan ideas, some of the Celtic ideas, or even do you see it in, some of the North American tribes and their stories? Do you see it in Indian culture? Where else does Pan appear?
I think Pan. Uh, that's a tough question. Pan is distinct in a lot of ways. Um, he, I mean, he was distinct even in the ancient kind of Greek and Roman sort of world. If we're thinking about sort of other pantheons, the Egyptians, Herodotus talks about how at Mendes, the Egyptians worshipped a deity who had the horns of a goat and was at least rumored to be worshipped in rites involving goats and women. Um, and Herodotus does this kind of thing where he reports a kind of lurid story and then just says, "I don't know if it's true," and it's hard to know. But I think that in terms of other gods he's connected with, there is an ancient Vedic deity named Pushtan whose name, like Pan, seems to be connected with ancient Indo-European roots involving pastures and things like that. He's also connected with goats. He drove a solar chariot of some kind and rewarded his followers with pastures and things like that. But I think if we're thinking about sort of more gods that might be more familiar to us, I think Pan can also be seen as a kind of trickster, in that he undermines the order of things, and so even a god like Loki might be one to kind of think about there, and many ancient writers thought Pan was the son of Hermes, who was the among other things a kind of trickster god of thieves for the Greeks. Hermes, Mercury in the Roman pantheon. But so he has these. I guess he has these different aspects. Ones that are related to the natural world, and ones that are maybe more along the sort of trickster spectrum of things. Um, yeah. So
yeah, with the trickster, that's kind of where I relate to it as well, because I see a lot of part of that playfulness, right? I've got a 9-year-old daughter right now who she's like on this prank spree where she can't help but find ways she did some silly pranks. Like she went in my closet and hid all of my socks. So I went to get socks and all my socks are gone. And she did this thing where she got into my wife's purse and she took all of her cards, like credit cards, driver's license, and they were all kind of just together. And so she took little stickies and she like put them between all of them so that when my wife went to pull out her card at a store, all of her cards came out and then she's like peeling them apart one at a time.
Oh no.
And so and I brought this up a couple of times with Peter Pan, but again, like childish, trickster, plays a flute, he flies around, he lives in a tree. So yeah, I definitely see the trickster side of it. What about with like modern characters, some of the stories that are more modern or classical stories, fairy tales, that kind of thing? Where do you see Pan come up in those?
Gosh. I think I think one place to start is with Peter Pan, because as you point out, I mean, he obviously has Pan in his name, right? But he also plays that little pipe, and he is connected with the natural world. I mean, he Never Land, living in the woods there with his little band of lost boys who are in a way kind of modern reimaginings of the fauns or satyrs or panes, that sort of little woodland kinds of spirits that Pan was typically associated with. And there is it's interesting too, because Peter Pan is obviously a really sympathetic character. He has a lot of compassion for Wendy, and um, he fits in with that version of Pan that kind of comes out in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, like in The Wind in the Willows, the piper at the gates of dawn, who this chapter is often omitted from American versions of the book, but he is very much a Pan figure, and he's protecting a little baby otter, and there's the two animals, the water rat and the mole, discover him and uncover the baby otter that he's protecting at his feet. But Pan develops these kind of surprising associations with innocence and compassion that are different from what we see in a lot of portrayals of him in the ancient world. Although there were some stories in ancient times showing Pan being compassionate towards lovers, for example, and it's the story of Daphnis and Chloe. He helps them out and rescues Chloe and so on. And Peter Pan is very much in that kind of tradition. I think if we're thinking of other stories, I mean, we have Pan appear in the Percy Jackson series, um, which I'm watching. I'm watching with my stepson right now, and I don't think we're going to get to Pan in this first season. But in the Percy Jackson series, Pan is missing, and the satyrs have to find him. And when they do, he's very much a fading power. And I guess it's a spoiler alert on Pan and Percy Jackson, but he's disappearing from the world, and the reason is we haven't cared for the wilderness enough. And if we want that wilderness, if we want that connection with nature, we have to figure it out for ourselves. And so he does remain as that kind of presence, even today. And I kind of like that version too, because it's like challenging us. It's not enough to say, oh, Pan's out there in the wilderness, everything is well, but really kind of turning it back on us and saying, well, how have we cared for the wilderness? How have we honored that?
Yeah. Do you see any kind of connection between that and the story you shared earlier from the Greeks where Pan had died? Is there some kind of analogy between the Greek world and our world today?
Yeah, I think that the idea of Pan sort of fading from our world and um, leaving the future of nature, the wild, up to us um, is sort of sending a message, but it's a different one. It's not clear, and it's not clear in Plutarch what the death of Pan means in that particular moment. Christians find a particular meaning in it, but it's not really clear. I think in the case of Pan fading away in Percy Jackson, the meaning is a lot more clear. And if we're thinking about the death of Pan and what that means to us, the death of Pan, in some ways, if we identify Pan with the wilderness, has become a little more of a literal possibility for us if we think about climate change and the effect that's having on environments and species extinctions and things like that. I mean, if Pan is the wilderness in a very real sense, Pan is fading away or dying off, and so again, it sort of turns it back to us if we want to have that experience of the non-human world and all of its richness and diversity, and thinking about ourselves in relation to it. We need to make choices, collective choices, really, about how we relate to the wild.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just as an example of how myth can share or kind of open our eyes to the world we're experiencing, or it can share something with us that's not a direct statement, but like you were saying before, you have this resonance with it. There's a numinous experience where it means something, and because it's in the myth instead of an activist screaming at us, then you can almost absorb it better. You can come to feel the importance of it in a way that's, I would say, less defensive, because it's not so immediate. It's not so direct. And in a way, I think that's the power of myths. At the same time, one of the challenges of myths is how many people read it in a literal way. And I personally haven't seen the Percy Jackson series, but I can imagine people watching that and either missing the point because they see it in too literal of a way, or in another sense, missing the point because a lot of times in our modern day, it seems like stories are mostly for entertainment rather than some kind of creating some kind of inner thinking or inner dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And and I think that, the we need activists, we need people doing that kind of work, but just like, you know, I, scholarly studies of things, involve making arguments and making better arguments and so on. But arguments have their limits. If we were only brains, sort of rationally processing the world, that would be enough. But we're not. And stories, I think, it's sort of sentimental to put it this way, but stories do connect the head and the heart. And if they give us that experience of the numinous, that sense of something other, something meaningful, something we can't just make sense of with our rational brains, they connect us with something more powerful that we can maybe draw upon, and you know that brings us, I don't know, brings us a sense of peace, or even energizes us to act and do the kind of work we might need to in our own lives, and perhaps for the world as well. Um, yeah.
Yeah. And I think another route to that is the other version, or kind of that other side piece of Pan that you were talking about, which was the trickster. To think of him as like the court jester, the comedian, somebody who pokes fun at the society. And going back to this world that I grew up in, this literal religious world, a lot of humor was not allowed because it was deemed inappropriate, or it was deemed too harsh, or it was cruel. But in a lot of ways, we need that character. In ancient times, the archetype of the clown was sacred. It was the sacred clown. And the same way that myths can kind of permeate us with these ideas that are difficult to deal with, the character of the jokester or the comedian is also critical. And I think even in our world today, there's a lot of pushback against comedians because they say things that come across offensive, or they come across insensitive. But in a lot of ways, what they're doing is, the reason that they make rooms laugh, that they make people laugh at home when they're watching it on recording, is that they're saying things that we know are true, but that we're hiding in our shadow, and that thing pokes us, and then we have to deal with it. And so I would guess that that's a big part of the Pan archetype, or the Pan god, in his role, is to just, it's probably why he, you were saying that we, as societies or as cultures, as we move forward, we kind of rediscover Pan in different ways, and he becomes these different things to us. And it seems that in our modern world, at least in one way, that's why Pan has come back up. He can never be fully, if he's ever fully dead or killed or removed, if he fades away, then I think we're actually in a really tough spot, because I think we need Pan.
Yeah, absolutely. And if some of the defining myths for us are progress, efficiency, technology, and there we have this shaggy, goat-headed god emerging from the shadows, playing his rustic pipes. We're he's really subverting, or at least calling into question our total reliance on these ultra modern, kind of futuristic ways of looking at the world, by in some ways drawing us back to our animal origins, kind of you know b- bringing our feet back onto the ground, and I think that humor is definitely a big part of that. I mean, it's humor brings us back down to earth, right? And Pan is similarly a figure who maybe reminds us of the divine in nature, but also reminds us that we're also shaggy animals in our own way, and we can dream about the future and machines and screens and everything else, but we're not going to escape the fact that we are bodies, and bodies can be beautiful. They can also be funny, and a source of pleasure and pain and all those things. But until we completely upload ourselves, we're going to have to acknowledge that part of ourselves. And I think humor is always a great way for us to realize uncomfortable truths, because it's not necessarily threatening, and it's enjoyable. It's pleasurable too. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
the figure of the trickster, the jokester, you know, jolts us awake, but in a way that, you know, feels good. That's fun. And even that feeling of transgression that we get
Mm.
with jokes we don't consider appropriate or offensive or whatever. There's a kind of thrill to that. And it is something we still feel is subversive and potentially dangerous. There's always people who feel the need to police humor because it takes us in directions maybe they don't want us to go. Um, so
Yeah, I always think about well, I love comedy. I'm a big fan of stand-up comedy. My wife and I, we're celebrating our anniversary, 15 years coming up, and so what we're
wow,
doing is
congratulations.
yeah, thank you. What we're doing is going to a comedy show because it's just nice to be able to go somewhere where everybody can let loose and laugh a little bit, especially when you do, when most comedians are poking fun at the society, you feel like, okay, like we're laughing at ourselves, and it's important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I do want to ask you about your upcoming work. What you're focused on now? You're on sabbatical from teaching, and you're
Yeah.
working on something. So what is this? What's over the horizon for you?
Yeah, I'm currently working on my next book, which is Stories of the Stones, and this one is looking at the way that we've imagined the stories we've created about prehistoric sites, places like Stonehenge, probably the most famous, but other places like Avebury, um, Newgrange in Ireland, Karnak and Brittany. These places that endure from prehistoric times are part of the landscape, but which are kind of ultimately unknowable. And I'm really fascinated by the way we respond to that mystery by creating stories. And so the book is looking at the stories and also the way these sites have been represented in art and film and television as well through the centuries. So and I think it's a really fun book for me to write because I get to watch really films and British science fiction from the 1970s and things like this. But in a way, it does harken back to Pan because these are also stories that are really thinking about our relationship to the environment and to the landscape and are also confronting this kind of deep unknowable mystery and thinking about what it means for us. So that should be out. I think it'll probably be out next year, um, hopefully. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, when it is available, you have to come back on and share. We'll do a deep dive into that as well.
Yeah, I'd love to.
But I'm curious, what is it now that you said that this one also relates to Pan? I'm curious, what is it then that drew you to this character, and what keeps you kind of coming back to it from a personal level?
That's a great question. I think um, the immediate version was so I'm an English professor and I've write I've written a fair bit of sort of literary criticism, that kind of thing. And I was reading D.H. Lawrence, an English writer who brings Pan into quite a few things he's working on in the early 20s. And that sort of got me thinking about Pan more generally and um, realizing that Pan had actually been kind of an important figure to me over the years. I grew up. I'm Canadian, and I grew up reading a lot of British books, and uh, I I loved an absolute favorite was Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows, and again it features Pan as the figure of the Piper of the Gates of Dawn, this kind of god of the animals, and that was an absolute favorite when I was growing up, and I don't know, I'd always just kind of had an affection and an interest in Pan, and just started to see Pan everywhere, and that was kind of how that came about.
Yeah,
So
that's
yeah,
when you start diving into myth, you start seeing the archetypes, the characters playing out all over. Um,
yeah,
well,
absolutely.
well, Paul, this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate you coming on and chatting with me about your work and the things that interest you. I'm really glad that there are people out there like you who do these deep dives and share that information with the world because I think it's fascinating and it's interesting and it's fun. I get curious about it, but I also think that the more that we come to have these analysis of stories, both from the past and the present, the more we start to see, the purpose of the myth, and also just we can move from that literal interpretation into something that's much more helpful, much more psychological, where we can all, find a way to grow from it. So I really appreciate that. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah. And before we get off, do you want to just share really quick where people can find your work, either books or on social media, or also your new Substack?
Sure. Yeah. You can find Pan. You can order it through your local independent bookstore. That would be great. But it's also available through Amazon, in Barnes and Noble online in North America, Blackwell's in the UK, I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle's at Paul J. Robichaud, and you can find me on Substack as with my newsletter Thresholds.
Okay, awesome. And I'll also include all those links in the show notes as well, so people can find them. But again, thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And goodbye. Bye, everybody.